What I was referring to was the fact that in one of the readings we have a gratuitous beheading, and then in the other reading we have one of only 2 chapters in the Bible that deal with the issue of predestination. So Steve's away on holiday. How convenient. Meant to be, you might almost say. But actually, anyone who knows me knows that I'm probably not one to try and duck a tricky subject. And this one has actually got absolutely profound implications for how we approach tough times. So I hope you will agree that it's well worth spending some time thinking about it. I mean, I don't know what circumstances you yourself find yourself in this morning, whether you're facing tough times or whether right now is actually a more buoyant, easier time in your life. On the one hand, when we face tough times, we need to know whether God is with us in those tough times. And on the other hand, if actually now is a buoyant and very high moment in your life, if you like, we need to be prepared for when things are not as easy as they are right now. So from Ephesians chapter 1, we have this idea in verse 5. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as sons through Jesus Christ. Sons. Now, not obviously that anyone who's female will become male in heaven, but that actually in the culture of Paul's day, he was writing about adopted sons. Adopted sons meant heirs, meant inheritors. We are predestined to inherit the perfection of heaven alongside Jesus himself. Which means that everyone should have a little bit of a smile on their face right now, because that is fantastic good news. This is the good news of the gospel. And then in verse 11 of Ephesians chapter 1, in him we were also chosen. And the word that the NIV translates as chosen is actually all about being chosen to inherit. It's picking up exactly the same idea again. Allotted a portion or a share, if you like. So chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity to the purpose of his will. It almost sounds as if Paul is saying that God doesn't just know in advance what will happen in the world, but that God plans it out, both the good and the bad, both the holy and the wicked. It almost sounds as if when God calls, we have no choice but to follow. It's been predestined. One of the things that we were singing earlier in the song In Christ Alone, from life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. Is that really the way it is? If we're Christians, it is because God has chosen us. God has given us the grace to believe. And is it really that God has made us in a way so that we can't even resist his grace to help us believe? Now, actually, this kind of approach to life, where we have this idea that Jesus does quite literally plan out every step of the way for us, can be an enormously comforting thing. Don't get me wrong in that. It's this idea that God is in control. Whatever happens, good or bad, it's to God's glory. Responsibility for life and choice ultimately lies with God, and there is a sense of liberation that comes with that. There is a sense in which this can be incredibly comforting. And these ideas about predestination and the providence of God have some very heavyweight theological supporters. Right from the church father St. Augustine, through the reformer John Calvin, to contemporary heavyweights like John Piper. But if we stop for a moment to have a think about the implications, there is actually a major problem with this view of faith. So think for a moment about that other passage that we heard read this morning. It's describing the beheading of John the Baptist. It's an act of revenge, and it's on the whim of some partygoers. And if his elderly parents were still alive at the time of his death, can you imagine how they might or might not have been comforted by a concerned and faithful friend? And in what follows, I am not in any way trying to lay out for you what my pastoral approach would be in this kind of situation. So imagine it's a little bit like this. Zachariah, Elizabeth, I'm really sorry to hear about John's cruel and utterly meaningless execution, but it was God's will. God predestines everything, so somehow good will come out of it. God decided in advance that it would happen. And, well, all things happen for his glory, so stiff upper lip, keep praising God, because he's good, he loves us, and this was just a part of his blueprint for yours and John's lives. Doesn't go down so well, does it? One wonders if this is really what Paul meant when he wrote that letter to the Ephesians. After all, at the time, he was a prisoner of conscience, a prisoner for his faith. Was this God's will for him? God's good purposes for every step of his life? And we don't need to just apply this to things that happened 2,000 years ago. In a contemporary situation, what would we say to ourselves or our friends when we hit tragedy? I'm sorry, God willed for a deranged gunman to shoot everyone on the beach. God willed for the Nepal earthquake and the immediate deaths and the ongoing suffering for hundreds of thousands of people. I don't think it really is like that somehow. Because these blueprint ideas about predestination make speaking of the love of God extremely difficult. Fortunately, as thinking Christians, we have other options open to us when it comes to understanding predestination and understanding God's providence. And those who take a different view of predestination also have a whole bunch of heavyweight theologians supporting their views. The one who stood as the critic of John Calvin was a guy called Jacobus Arminius, a Dutchman. And slightly more recently, but not that much more recently, of course, within Methodism, John Wesley stood very much opposed to those kind of ideas. There are two things from that passage in Ephesians chapter 1 that I want you to really take note of. The first is the idea that that passage about predestination is written to people who are already believers. I've mentioned that predestination, it's only mentioned in 2 chapters of the Bible, Ephesians chapter 1 and Romans chapter 8. In both cases, the context is virtually identical, written to groups of believers. In Ephesians 1, verse 1, the letter is to the saints in Ephesus, the faithful in Christ Jesus. And there's a similar greeting in Romans. The context is, to the believers, we are predestined. So that's the first point to take note of. The second point to take note of is that predestination is being spoken of in the big picture of salvation, not at an individual level. And that is equally the case in Romans as it is in Ephesians chapter 1. Here, the whole of the world will be brought to the perfection that God desires for it. In Ephesians 1 verse 10, Paul describes God's purpose to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ. The predestination is of those who believe they are predestined to the glorious future, the new heavens, the new earth that God has planned out under one head, even Christ. You will note from the way that I've approached this that personally I have great difficulty with the Calvinist idea that we are individually predestined and therefore cannot resist God's grace, but have to believe and become heirs and inheritors. I say have to believe. From our perspective, we would feel like it was free will. The trouble with that approach is that I am left asking, what about those not fortunate enough to be predestined for grace? It won't surprise you then to know that I personally subscribe to this Arminian idea that by freely responding to the call of God, that free response which is open to absolutely everybody, by becoming a believer of our own free will, then we are predestined to inherit the perfect new heavens and new earth that God is working towards. Predestination, about the big picture, the whole of the cosmos made perfect, made to glorify God. So with Calvinism, people are chosen and cannot resist God's grace. They will believe, even if to them the choice appears to be made freely. With Arminianism, we freely believe, and by believing we become part of the body of believers, the church, and we are therefore predestined as a church to inherit, as God has promised, the church to inherit his perfect new heavens and new earth. And I'm going to stop for a moment and just give an apology. This may sound desperately, desperately theoretical to people. And I realise that that's kind of where we've been so far. And so I apologise for that. I think it's worth the theory so that we can appreciate the implications of the difference between those two approaches to predestination. You see, if we have genuine free will, then God does not determine in advance how we will respond. God freely chooses to relinquish control to his created beings. That means God gives control to you and to me for the choices that we make. And just like Adam and Eve in the garden, we sometimes, and actually sometimes very often, make the wrong choices, make the destructive choices, make the choices that God does not want us to make. But it seems that God values freedom so much that he has allowed this to continue. He's allowed it to continue, but not without providing a way back to his perfection. Not without predetermining that all who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Not without that great cost to himself of sending Jesus to die in our place, so that everyone who freely accepts his self-sacrifice for us then becomes predestined to inherit the new and the perfect world that God will bring about. And what this means is that when we ourselves face tragedy, we can know deep down that actually God is grieving with us. God did not plan for our life to be like that. And that actually God has a far better eternal future predestined for all of us who freely choose to believe even through the hardest of times. It means that when we spend time with people who are the Zachariah and Elizabeths of this world, Zachariah and Elizabeth were the parents of John the Baptist. When we spend time with those kind of people, it's not stiff upper lip, it's all part of God's plan. Actually, we are free to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. Because the God who limits himself to allow us freedom, God will be grieving with them too. So it allows us to engage with the suffering of others, not because it is part of God's plan, but actually because God is grieving with them as much as we are. And equally, it allows us to rejoice in a proper and meaningful way, as Paul is doing in this first chapter of Ephesians. Even as he writes from a prison, he's able to write that actually God has chosen us, the church. God has chosen the church, the believers, the people who have freely chosen him. God has chosen the church to be holy and blameless in his sight. God has chosen the church to be adopted to inherit, to be redeemed, to be forgiven. These are all the ideas that come through that first chapter of Ephesians. We have been chosen to exist for the glory of God. So we are able to engage with the suffering of others because God is actually grieving with them. But we're also able to engage with the rejoicing that it means to come to faith in Jesus, because actually, with that free choice, God has predestined us to the perfection that he will be bringing about in the future for everyone who freely chooses him. I'm going to stop here, and hopefully Gaz will give us just a few moments to ponder these kind of ideas. And as we do that, if you have questions that come to mind. I will be around after the service. This is not an easy subject. It's an incredibly difficult subject. Theologians wrangle about this subject and have done for centuries. But actually, I'm suggesting that there is a way in which, when tough times hit, we can engage with the suffering of others. And yet, when rejoicing comes, we can also rejoice with others. So, like I say, if questions are coming to mind, please do feel free to grab me after the service and talk about it. Because, like I say, these are difficult issues, but they profoundly affect the way that we actually talk to people who are suffering hard times, the way in which we ourselves prepare for when we might face tough times.